When we think of the Roman Empire, what usually comes to mind are brave legions, disciplined soldiers, shining helmets, razor-sharp swords. But there's a side of the story that's rarely talked about. Rome didn't draw its power from courage alone. It drew it from debt. Because behind those massive armies was an incredibly expensive system. Thousands of soldiers had to be fed. Weapons, roads, bridges, fortresses. Feed for horses, timber for siege engines, craftsmen, laborers. None of this was free. It was all money. And a lot of money. So how did Rome manage it? Let's pause for a moment and rewind. In the early Republic, Rome's army was essentially the people themselves. If you owned land, you could be called to serve. You brought your own weapons. When the war ended, you expected to return home, to your field. But Rome grew. Wars grew longer. Front lines moved far from home. This system no longer worked. Rome now needed professional soldiers. And professional soldiers demand pay. That's where everything changed. The state began paying soldiers wages called stipendium. They weren't very high, but they were enough to buy loyalty. Then something even more important happened. War turned into a source of income. Every new conquest meant new taxes, new slaves, new mines, new tributes. In other words, war paid for itself. And often, much more than that. At first, this sounded reasonable. But this kind of system had a problem. Once it started working, it never wanted to stop. Expansion was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. Sound familiar? Rome didn't rely on taxes alone. It borrowed heavily. Especially during the long Punic Wars with Carthage, the state took large loans from wealthy Romans. From the financial class known as the equites. But these were not donations. They were investments. And like any investment, they expected returns. Interest. Rights to collect taxes. Commercial privileges in newly conquered lands. Slowly, war truly became a business model. Who benefited? Those who financed the wars. Who made the decisions? Generals who could promise loot. The Senate gradually began to resemble less a body of state wisdom and more a club of shareholders. Private contractors known as publicani handled everything from tax collection to logistics. Without realizing it, Rome was turning into a military financial system dressed in togas. But everything has a price. Soldiers' wages. Interest on debts. Endless campaigns. When new conquests slowed, the state began to struggle badly. And the oldest solution came into play. Debasing the currency. From the reign of Nero onward, the silver content of the denarius was gradually reduced. No one announced it loudly. But this continued for 2 centuries. What was the result? Inflation. Loss of trust. Money became nothing more than a promise. The wealthy protected themselves. They bought land, bought slaves, moved their wealth elsewhere. What did the people do? They tried to survive with worthless money. They paid heavier taxes. They were forcibly conscripted. This was not so much a military collapse as a monetary one. Now stop for a moment and look at today. Wars financed by debt. Massive budget deficits. Problems postponed by printing money. Those growing richer through defense contracts. Those crushed by inflation. The names may have changed, but the mechanics are strikingly familiar. In Rome, it was called tribute. Today, we call it taxes. We call it monetary expansion. We call it monetary policy. But the outcome is always the same. Debt grows. Money loses value. Those with assets are protected. Those who live on wages lose. Rome tells us this. An economy built on violence and expansion cannot last forever. One day, there is no land left to conquer. Resources run out. And the system collapses inward. At that point, the state turns to its people. More taxes. More control. More money printing. Bread and circuses. While the elites raise their walls higher. Familiar, isn't it? So what can you do? You can't step outside the system. But you can understand it. If you see the pattern, you no longer look at everything the same way. When you hear about a crisis, you ask. Who lent the money? Who benefited? And who is paying in the end? Because history teaches us this. Empires don't fall when enemies reach the gates. They fall when the math stops working. And when no one dares to speak the truth. If this narrative gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History hides the answers. I just show you where to shine the light.